Here's a guy who thinks that evolution is in the Bible.
And what I do in this episode is compare the science of evolution with the depiction of Moses as he wrote how creation happened in the Bible. Now, if you think about it, evolution says that we all have common ancestors, that humans and plants, the tree outside your house, at one point in history has a common ancestor. And all scientists, pretty much all scientists on the planet, agree upon that evolution is a fact. Now, but what science has a problem right now, there's a controversy in science today. No one really knows how life actually started. Because what happened is about 4.5 billion years ago, something very large crashed into our Earth and it became molten rock, and a piece of that flew off and became our moon. And a few hundred million years later, as the Earth cooled down, as soon as it was fertile enough, or as soon as it possibly could spring forth life, life began on Earth. And most scientists believe that it all came from a pool of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, water, and some burst of energy ignited life. Well, there's another group of scientists that have come on in the last decade, and they have questioned that idea, and they believe that life was delivered here in microbial life form on the side of an asteroid.
There are scientists who have hypothesized that this is possible, but it really doesn't explain the origin of life because it doesn't explain how the extraterrestrial life developed. Even if life on Earth came from an asteroid carrying it from elsewhere, it still ultimately had to develop from more basic chemistry.
And it's very logical. Listen to the argument here. They say to the one group of scientists, wait a minute, if the Earth can spring forth life almost as soon as it was physically possible to spring forth life, why wasn't there multiple strands of life? Why do we all have one common ancestor billions of years ago that created trees billions of years later and humans billions of years later? If it sprang forth life, and let's just say, for example, hypothetical example, life sprang forth in Australia first, 4.3 billion years ago. Then how come another strain of life just didn't pop up in Siberia 2.2 billion years ago? And how come another strain of life just didn't combust and come into existence 1 billion years ago in the Middle East?
Well, one reason is that none of these places existed at the time, and another is that they're all on land and the first life had to develop in an ocean. Also, when biologists say that everything developed from a single ancestor, they're not saying that there were never other forms of life, only that if there were, those forms of life have no living descendants. There plausibly were other forms that were simply outcompeted by the life form from which we are descended. It's like how there used to be several different species of human and now there's only one. It could have been the case that there were several different forms of life and only our ancestors ultimately survived.
That's a problem for scientists. They're saying that life sprang forth one single time on Earth.
No, they're not.
Almost at the very essence or the very moment it was possible to spring forth life, and it came forth only one time in the history of the Earth.
That's not what scientists say. They don't know whether there were other forms of life that developed independently or not.
Well, so scientists say that doesn't sound too logical. Therefore, is there a different or a competing theory? And the competing theory is that maybe a piece of microbial life was attached to an asteroid and hit Earth about 4.3 billion years ago in this watery, very moist planet, and that started life on Earth. That's the controversy in science today.
That's not a competing theory, because even if life came from an asteroid, that still must have developed chemically. The Panspermia hypothesis is not contrary to the theory of abiogenesis. Both can be true at the same time, and there really isn't much controversy about Panspermia because there really isn't much evidence for it.
But think about what that means. If that is true, then that means plants or microbial life existed before our sun and our earth were created.
Microbial life and plants are not synonymous. All plants consist of eukaryotic cells. Those are cells with a nucleus. The earliest eukaryotes evolved only 2 billion years ago. Prokaryotic microbial cells, which have no nucleus and which are not plants, appeared over 1 billion years prior. So even if it is the case that the earliest cells came to Earth from space, they were absolutely not plants. Terrestrial plants did not exist before the sun was created.
Meaning, if there's an asteroid floating around in space with a microbial life on it, it existed before our sun and moon were created. They had to be floating around before that. And guess what Moses says in the book of Genesis? Moses says the first thing that was created was light, which agrees with the Big Bang Theory. He says the second thing that was created were clouds. And Moses says water with some clouds or firmament above and some clouds or firmament below, which basically agrees with the Big Bang Theory. There was light, then clouds. But Moses says that plants were created next on day 3 before our sun and moon were created.
Which is false. Again, plants didn't appear on Earth until 2 billion years ago, which is 2.6 billion years after the sun first formed.
Well, if scientists ever do prove that microbial life came on the side of asteroid to fertilize this Earth, they will be proving Moses once again wasn't writing fiction.
He was if he says plants appeared before the sun did.
That he was writing nonfiction. And Moses once again will be validating the Big Bang Theory if this one group of scientists ever approve their theory. Now,
what does this have to do with the Big Bang Theory? The Big Bang says absolutely nothing about when the sun was formed or when plants appeared.
The second thing is on evolution is, the book of Genesis says that all plants came from the ground.
Did they come from the ground or did they come from an asteroid?
And they said, the book of Genesis also says that all of the fowl, the birds in the air, came from the ground. It says the beasts came from the ground, and Adam came from the dust of the ground. So one time I had a friend ask me, he said, are you telling me that every living organism on earth came from the same substance? And I said to him, listen, I didn't write the Bible. I'm just reading the Bible, right? So when I see a bird fly through the air, I don't know how Moses, 3,300 years ago, if he was sitting down to write fiction, would have said, hey, that bird flying through the air? Yeah, it came from the ground. I don't know how he would come up with that.
You know, I've heard Muslim apologists make similar arguments. They'll say things like, the Quran tells you to wash your hands, but before the germ theory of disease was developed, nobody who didn't read the Quran washed their hands. Clearly Muhammad had some special knowledge of proper hygiene before scientists ever did. How did he come up with that? Can't be a coincidence. Have I convinced you to convert to Islam yet?
Just like if I told you, hey, there's a huge jetliner airplane flying through the air, and that jet airliner came from the ground. Well, what I just told you was true. The metal came from the ground, the plastics came from the ground, the rubber on the tires came from the ground, the fuel in the tanks came from the ground. So the fact that I tell you that that plane or that jet came from the ground is absolutely true. The fact that I don't tell you how long it took man to make that plane from the ground doesn't mean it's not true. Just like if God doesn't tell you how long it took to take some ground and make a bird, the fact that he doesn't tell you how he did it or how long it took him to do it doesn't mean it's not true.
But it does say how long it took him. It says that animals were created on the 5th day, so it sounds like he created them all in one day. I know you believe that the days are metaphorical. In your video about the Big Bang, you assert that the 13.8 billion years the universe has existed lines up with the 6 days of creation, meaning that each day of creation is 2.3 billion years. So if your hypothesis that the days of creation are a metaphor for 2.3 billion year spans of time, then even according to that, the Bible still gives you some idea how long it took.
Therefore, I'm sitting here reading the Bible and reading the evolution science, and I'm saying, wait a minute, is Moses validating evolution or is evolution validating Moses? Because he says we all came from the same substance, the ground. Evolution basically says the same thing. Now, you can ask yourself, why didn't Moses go into the DNA and all those technical terms? Well, Moses uses the term dust of the ground when he talks about Adam's body. And 3,300 years ago, the smallest particle known to man was dust. When you see sunshine coming through a window on a cloudy day, and you got a little dust in the air, that would be the smallest particle any person would know. So rather than Moses going into DNA and the whole thing, Maybe Moses knew it, maybe he didn't know it. I don't know. But he uses the smallest thing that anyone would understand 3,300 years ago, that Adam's body was created from the dust of the ground.
I don't think folks were so ignorant at the time that if Moses wanted to talk about smaller particles, people couldn't have understood the concept of smaller particles.
So therefore, I'm asking the question once again to all my scientist friends. How did Moses do it? If you believe that Moses was writing fiction, then how did he get so much stuff so right?
Again, Muslim apologists love to point out things in the Quran and Hadith which vaguely seem consistent with modern science, as though they are evidence of divine knowledge. Why should I take you any more seriously than you take them? To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.